In this video, I'd like to talk about business cycle models and how we model business cycles, in particular with respect to the Keynesian and classical model. In chapter 8, the end of chapter 8, there's an introduction to the Keynesian and classical models and the assumptions underlying those models in terms of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. In chapter 9, we introduce IS and LM and FE, along with the aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. So I want to just say a few things about those models in terms of the assumptions that are underlying those models and how we can use them and what the implications are of those assumptions in terms of the models that we're using. So we're going to I'm going to switch. I'm going to do some drawing here. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to write down some notes so you can see them. So I want to start by just talking about business cycles more generally. This part of the course, we're talking about deviations away from the long run growth of the economy or potential real GDP, full employment real GDP. One of the key things that's important to understand is that deviations away from that long run trend in terms of our model, in terms of modeling macroeconomic behavior, have to do with shocks to the economy. So all of what we do in our model is talk about something shocking the economy, something happening, and then following through what happens to all the different variables, real GDP, the real interest rate, the price level, the unemployment rate, level of unemployment, investment, saving, consumption, as a response to those shocks. And we typically break down the shocks into two different types, either shocks to aggregate demand or spending in the economy, or shocks to supply. So we can talk about demand shocks and supply shocks. So everything we do is about something happening, and then we ask what happens in the economy as a result of that. And that's the business cycle behavior that we're talking about. In chapter 8, we're talking about business cycle facts. We're talking about the timing and the pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical nature of different economic variables. Do they move with the cycle, along with output and other major variables in the economy, or do they not move in the same direction? Are they counter-cyclical? And does that match up with what we actually experience in the real, actual US economy historically? All right? So business cycles then come from shocks to the economy. Right? Without any shocks, the economy would tend to grow on its long run path of potential real GDP. It would grow as fast as real GDP is growing. And the things that cause real GDP to grow, as we learned back in chapter 3, are things that shift the production function or things that shift labor supply in the economy. Because anything that shifts the production function will shift labor demand. So labor demand, labor supply, the labor market, and the production function, the amount of capital, technology, education, things like that, along with the amount of labor, amount of employment, determine the level of real GDP in the economy. And those are the things that cause real GDP, the full employment level of real GDP, to change over time. When we're talking about business cycles, we're talking about, typically, we're talking about deviations away from full employment real GDP or potential GDP. So those shocks either come from aggregate demand or they come essentially from aggregate supply. Demand side shocks and supply side shocks. Demand side shocks come from spending, changes in spending. Spending could be C or I or G or net exports, right? Those are the main components of aggregate demand. Demand is spending by the different groups, households, firms, the government, and other countries. So there's shocks to spending that occur. Could be that consumers get concerned about the economy and don't and cut back on their spending. Government spending, fiscal policy could go up. Taxes on income taxes could change, which changes saving and changes consumer spending. So demand side shocks affect aggregate demand, and supply side shocks, aggregate supply, have to do with either the production function, right? Things that affect the shocks to the production function, or things that affect the labor supply, right? Production function and the marginal product of labor, all right? So those are the things that, and depending whether you're a classical economist or a Keynesian economist, will determine which one you believe has a bigger role to play in the economy. So Keynesian economists, John Maynard Keynes, right? John Maynard Keynes thought and believed, and Keynesian economists believe that shocks to spending are what lead to business cycles in the economy, whereas classical economists, or new classical economists these days, and they're new Keynesians as well, believe that the shocks have to come from the supply side of the economy. Then it's a question of, well, in reality, which ones tend to have a bigger role in the real world? The answer to that is both do, which is why we don't have one single model or one way of using our model in terms of the Keynesian and classical assumptions. We have one model that we use, the ISLM FE, and aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. But depending on the assumptions, we get different kinds of behavior, which we'll look at in just a moment. So for the Keynesians, right, the assumption is that prices and wages do not adjust quickly. They may be fixed in the short run. They don't change very fast. Okay, so that's going to lead to one set of assumptions, or one set of outcomes in the economy when there are shocks to the economy. In the classical model, the assumption is that prices and wages do adjust quickly. That is the big difference between them, and it has big implications for how we view the economy. All right. So the assumption in the classical model is that prices are flexible, wages are flexible, and so the only things that affect output, as we'll see in just a moment, in that kind of situation are changes in aggregate supply, changes in the supply side of the economy. Whereas if prices are not flexible, do not adjust quickly, if they're fairly sticky, that's what we call sticky prices and sticky wages, right? Then it's the case that changes in aggregate demand can have significant implications for real GDP and the business cycle, okay, in the economy. Now, let's take a look at quickly at the Keynesian and classical models. In chapter 8, the end of chapter 8, we're talking about business cycle behavior and business cycle facts. And if we think about the classical model first, remember the assumption is that prices and the nominal wages are flexible and they adjust quickly. Okay. In that kind of situation, if we use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which has the price level, the CPI on the vertical axis, consumer price index, let's say, or other things that measure the price level overall in the economy, and Y, real GDP, on the horizontal axis, we have aggregate demand, the downward sloping curve, that comes from the IS and LM curves. IS has to do with the goods market. LM has to do with the asset market. And we have long run aggregate supply. And that has to do with the production function and labor market. So in this case, this is potential GDP. The economy is at full employment, right? Generally at equilibrium. Aggregate demand and lower aggregate supply determine the equilibrium in the economy. It determines the price level. And any changes in this case in aggregate demand, as you see, right, increases or decreases in aggregate demand, right, all they do is change the price level. Let's call it P1 to go with aggregate demand 1 and P2 to go with aggregate demand 2. Changes in aggregate demand do not have any impact on output in the classical model. They only affect the price level. Changes in consumption and government spending and taxes, etc., right, only affect the price level in the case when prices and wages adjust quickly. Okay. So in the ISLM model, if there's a shift in aggregate demand, which is a shift in IS curve or the LM curve, then LM curve is going to adjust to bring us back to full employment, right? In the labor market, if there is a change, then due to the real wage changing, well, then the nominal wage is going to change along with the price level, the real wage. There's no impact on labor demand, labor supply in the labor market. So there's no impact on output in the labor market. So in that kind of case, when we think about the business cycle facts in chapter 8, right? Business cycles have to do with fluctuations in real GDP around potential GDP. Well, the only way you can get real GDP to increase or decrease is if the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, right? So this is the reason why. So if there is some shock to long-run aggregate supply, let's say there's an increase in input prices like oil prices, well, that would tend to shift the longer aggregate supply curve to the left, at least temporarily. And in that case, if this was the aggregate demand curve, right, that's where we started out, then what would you see? You would see a reduction in real GDP. You would see an increase in the price level. It's called P3. So we use P2 down here. All right. So what does that mean? Higher oil prices in that case would cause a recession, a reduction in real GDP, a temporary movement away from what otherwise would be the long-run potential GDP, would cause inflation, price level to go up, right, from A to B. And as real GDP goes down, that's going to cause a shift in the IS curve. It's going to cause the real interest rate to go up, right? And in that case, we'll be back at a new level of full employment, which is lower than what it was before. Okay. So in order to get any business cycle behavior in the classical model, in order to get real GDP to go up and down, which is what we talk about with business cycles, right? It has to rely on supply side shocks. Right? To get recessions, you have to have adverse or negative supply side shocks. To get business cycle expansions, you have to have positive supply side shocks. Right? Things that either shift the production function or change labor supply in the labor market. The idea is you're always in equilibrium, just at different level of real GDP. So the classical model, then the question is, well, how do supply side shocks dominate the real world? Is that what causes business cycles, supply side shocks? Things like oil price increases. Well, in the case of the 1970s, the answer to that was yes. We saw recessions and we saw higher prices, inflation, stagflation. In fact, that was the thing that really caused challenges for the Keynesian model, as we'll see in a moment. But it doesn't leave much room. It doesn't leave any room for changes in aggregate demand changing the level of real GDP or causing business cycles. But in the real world, so for example, the money supply, which is part of aggregate demand, it's part of the asset market. The Federal Reserve reduces interest rates And that tends to increase aggregate demand. And we tend to see an expansion in output, lower unemployment, and maybe we see higher prices. But in the short run, the impact is more on the unemployment rate and on employment. So the classical model has a harder time explaining that real world business cycle fact, the fact that money, changes in the money supply, changes in monetary policy tend to have real effects on the economy. In the classical model, the assumption is if you increase the money supply rate or increase the money supply, reduce interest rates, and the Federal Reserve had expansionary monetary policy, we'd simply go from A up to, let's call it C, okay? A to C, right? Aggregate demand shifts out and you just move up the long-run aggregate supply curve. So that kind of behavior is a challenge for the classical model. Now let's move to the Keynesian model and think about that in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And remember, the assumption here is that the prices and nominal wages are sticky. They don't change fast, right? So in the Keynesian model, Keynesian economists have to have some story for why prices and wages might be sticky, okay? It's also the case that in the Keynesian model, in the Keynesian model, right? We can talk about unemployment. That's another challenge for the classical model because the assumption is that the labor market's always in equilibrium in the classical model. So how can you get unemployment changes in the unemployment rate? You're always at full employment, even though full employment level of real GDP may change if there are supply side shocks. Again, that's a challenge that classical economists need to be able to explain. And they would say, well, but markets don't adjust that quickly, in the labor market. So yes, you can get unemployment temporarily, but it tends to change really quickly. So classical model was the one that was in play before the Great Depression. Keynes is writing in 1940s, early 1940s, mid 1940s. And he's writing about what happened during the Great Depression when, the labor market didn't go into equilibrium quickly. There were unemployment rates that were double digit for most of a decade. That is not going back to equilibrium quickly. And so his model, his assumption, what he did is just change the assumptions, right? He said, what if prices and wages are sticky? Well, in that case, in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right, the aggregate supply curve, instead of being vertical, it's exactly the opposite. It's horizontal. And so prices are sticky, right, at that price level in the economy. We have the aggregate demand, which looks the same, right? And aggregate demand, aggregate supply determine the level of real GDP, the actual level of real GDP. Right? And in this kind of model, you can see that if there's an increase in aggregate demand, the impact is on real GDP, not on the price level, right, as in the classical model. Reductions in aggregate demand cause a reduction in real GDP, right? So the actual level of real GDP is moving around in response to shocks to aggregate demand. So in that case, what Keynes is arguing is if reductions in aggregate demand, maybe because consumers have lost jobs, they're concerned about the future, they're not spending as much, right? And aggregate demand shrinks since consumption is the biggest part of GDP and aggregate demand, aggregate spending, about 2/3 of aggregate demand. So if there are changes in consumer desires to spend, then we're going to see changes in overall aggregate demand and overall changes in real GDP. That was the argument. And so he's saying, well, look, if that happens, we can get, if we're started here, we could get stuck in a place. And let's say that we started out, let's say this was potential GDP. So in a sense, we can use that longer aggregate supply curve from the classical model, but in this case, it's really just a marker. It's a marker of potential GDP, full employment, real GDP, and changes in aggregate demand cause real GDP to either go above that or below that. This is a recession. This is an expansion. And the price level we assume is fixed, at least for some period of time. So in that case, we can get, again, these fluctuations, right? If this is over time, real GDP, and over time it's generally increasing long run, right? That's potential GDP, generally increasing as population increases, technology increases, et cetera. But the actual real GDP can fluctuate around that, which is what we see. We have business cycles. So that's the actual level of real GDP. That's what we're talking about here. Right? So the actual level of real GDP fluctuating around the long run aggregate supply or potential GDP. Shocks to aggregate demand then can move us away from full employment, can cause a recession, for example. Right? So increases in tax rates could cause consumers to cut back on spending. Or if businesses decide to spend less on new equipment, then because they're concerned, let's say, about the future, that's going to lead to a reduction in aggregate demand. And then a reduction in level of real GDP. So what would the classical economists say about that? Well, they would say the price level is going to adjust to bring us back to full employment. Now, Keynesian model, the Keynesians would say, well, okay, maybe that's true. And over time, right, let's say that there's a big push in aggregate demand that pushes us beyond potential GDP. So we're out here, right? It's greater than potential GDP. And what's going to happen over time is that the price level is going to rise. This short run, it's really a short run aggregate supply curve, will start to increase as the price level goes up. And will move slowly, right? It will keep happening as long as we're beyond potential GDP until eventually that short run aggregate supply curve, I'll call it N, is right there. So we've gone from A out to C to D to E to F. So eventually, right? But that's just like the classical model, right? The classical model, all we had was aggregate demand, a shift in aggregate demand, moving up that long-run aggregate supply curve. But we went up there very quickly. We didn't stop off out here first, right? And Keynes would say, well, you know, in the long run, those prices are going to go up. But in the long run, we're all dead. That's a famous saying of his, right? So he's more concerned about what happens in the short run. And what you can also see is that if there's a decline in aggregate demand that pushes us below potential GDP, right? The actual is less than potential in that case, back here at B, then and you might get stuck there for a while because prices don't necessarily adjust quickly to get you back. In that case, prices will be going down until finally we get down here, but you might be stuck there for a long time. So what can you do in that case? Well, if you're the government, the federal government, you can reduce taxes, you can increase government spending, and try and push that aggregate demand curve back to potential GDP, back to full employment. Now, there's one other thing that we need to say something about here in regard to this, and that has to do with unemployment. The thing that we have to say about this in the Keynesian model is that we drop the classical labor market, right? Labor demand, labor supply. And we don't necessarily drop it, but we assume what Keynesians assume essentially is that, right, here's labor demand, labor supply, as we've talked about it, the real wage on the vertical axis, employment on the horizontal axis. For there to be unemployment, right? And the Keynesians would agree, would say, or would argue, I should say, that if there's a decline in aggregate demand that pushes us below potential GDP, then there's going to be unemployment. But in the classical model, in the classical labor market, right, in the model of the labor market in the classical model, right, the idea would be that we'd quickly move to equilibrium in the labor market. But in the Keynesian, model, the assumption is that the real wage is sticky, it does not adjust quickly, right? Nominal wages are sticky, right? And so we're in a situation where the quantity of labor supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, which is a surplus of labor, which is unemployment. And so the argument in the Keynesian model is that when firms adjust, that firms adjust how much they produce in response to changes in demand for their goods and services. And that's their first response. It's not to change the prices of their goods. That's what happens in the classical model. It's to change the production. So if there's less demand, they produce less. If they produce less, they hire fewer workers or they lay off workers. If there's increased demand for their products, then they produce more and they hire more workers. And by hiring and demanding more or fewer workers, depending on what's happening in demand for their products, the unemployment rate either gets bigger or smaller. The idea simply is here that there's some pool of workers, right, who are unemployed, who can be called upon, right, to be hired, can be called upon to be hired to produce more goods and services in response to changes in aggregate demand, right? So that really is the idea, is that firms just respond by hiring the number of workers they need along the production function, essentially, right, to produce whatever is needed. And demand for labor just moves along with that. So it really is a replacement for the classical labor market, because the assumption there was that real wages adjust to bring about equilibrium. The assumption in the Keynesian model is that nominal wages, therefore real wages, are fixed or sticky. And the argument is that it is fixed and sticky at a level that is higher than the market clearing real wage. Now, there are theories about why that would be. If you want to dig in more in any of either of these models, either the Keynesian model or the classical model, you can look into chapters 10 and chapters 11, which we're not going to be covering here in the course this semester. We're going to move on to some other topics, right? But if you want to dig in terms of how the models that underlie that assumption and how that can be and how they've had to model things and come up with explanations for why that could be, that is part of what is in particular for the Keynesian model, chapter 10, and the classical model in chapter 11. Okay. But for our purposes right here, right, the idea is that in the Keynesian model, prices and wages are sticky. The short-run aggregate supply curve is horizontal and will slowly adjust as the price level adjusts, but that happens very slowly. In the classical model, the assumption is that prices and wages are flexible. Changes in aggregate demand, therefore, don't have any impact on output. Only changes, shocks to the economy in terms of supply shocks have an impact in the classical model. So the Keynesian model, in some respects, does some things that are better in terms of explaining the business cycle facts, the ups and downs of real GDP, in terms of spending, in terms of government policy, taxes and government spending, affecting aggregate demand, and that affecting unemployment rates and affecting output. But it doesn't have the ability to explain what happens with supply side shocks, and the fact that it doesn't have the ability to explain inflation very well in the Keynesian model. It also doesn't explain the fact that labor productivity is pro-cyclical. The classical model actually does do that with supply side shocks. For example, a positive supply side shock and increase in technology boosts the production function shifts it up, and that increases the marginal product of labor, the slope of the aggregate production function. So positive changes, positive shocks to aggregate supply affect positively real GDP, and then positively affect productivity. So that's what it means to be pro-cyclical. They move in the same direction. And that's in reality in the US economy historically, that's been true. In the Keynesian model, however, as aggregate demand increases and more real GDP is produced because firms hire more workers, but they're moving along the production function. And as you move further along the production function, you hire more workers, their marginal productivity actually gets lower. It's diminishing marginal productivity of labor. So it's moving in the opposite direction of what the real world data suggests, that as real GDP increases, marginal productivity of labor should increase. But in the Keynesian model, the model suggests that it goes down. The point about all of that is that neither the Keynesian model, the Keynesian assumption, or the classical model can explain all of the business cycle facts in a single way, which is why we still talk about Keynesian and classical models, even at this time, even though the Keynesian model has been around since the mid-1940s. But then we have new versions of the classical model that have come into place in the 1980s, and then new Keynesian models as well. The work by macroeconomists today is trying to bring these two models together to form one comprehensive model. But right now, we really still got two different versions, right? The underlying model is the same, ISL-MFE, or aggregate demand, aggregate supply, but we have different versions of this model depending on our assumptions about what happens to prices in terms of their flexibility and nominal wages. So that's a little bit of additional background that will help you understand the material in Chapter 9, the ISL-MFE model and aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And also link that back to the material in Chapter 8 regarding business cycles and business cycle facts and business cycle behavior. Remember, at the end of the day, what we're interested in is a model being good enough to be able to explain the actual business cycle behavior in the economy, right? So we're talking about, and that's true of any model in science, we need to be able to explain the observed behavior in the real world. We just don't have one single way of doing that in economics, because the classical nor the Keynesian model by themselves can explain all of the business cycle facts that we care about, in particular in terms of whether a variable is pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical. So that's why we have both models to work with yet at this point in time.